So I am Ellie Johns Kelly. I serve as your Ministry Relations Officer for the Presbyterian Foundation, which is the oldest and largest religious foundation in North America. We date back to 1799 when we were established as the original trustees of the denomination, with the purpose of receiving gifts and bequests from pious Presbyterians for mission and ministry. And we continue that today. So we're known for our planned giving work and our permanent endowment funds we have over $2 billion of assets under management. And I want to say over about 800 million of that are in true endowment funds. We are also known for investment management. So we have a number of different options available to churches. And in the last dozen years or so, we have been doing stewardship education. It used to be that belonged to our sister agency, the Presbyterian Mission Agency, but as unified giving began to decline, there weren't people who said, gee, I'd like to fund stewardship education for the whole denomination. And as a result, that office began to be dismantled. It only made sense, since the foundation did planned giving education, that we take on stewardship education. So I serve as your Ministry Relations Officer, which is a fancy way of saying I'm your regional representative. You will be seeing there'll be perhaps in the next 6 to 8 weeks, a new person taking over your territory. I'm not going away. It's just that my colleague Olanda Carr and I, who has the region immediately south of me, we have the two largest regions. I cover the Synod of the Trinity with the exception of 2 of their presbyteries, and all of the Synod of the Northeast. And so between the 2 of us, we have 1,300 more churches than our number 3 colleague. And so we are adding a 10th Ministry Relations Officer, and they're going to live in your territory. I am a minister member of Lake Erie Presbytery, but I live in the bounds of Washington Presbytery, which is southwestern Pennsylvania, right down here. My husband's on the faculty at West Virginia University, so that's what puts me so far down south in PA. But I am glad to be here with you today and really looking forward to the conversations we're going to have. I had offered to Karen that we would do 3 or 4 of these workshops about once a month. We're looking at our next one on May 11th to continue the conversation if you're interested. But really what we want to think about when I do small church forums is what's going on in our churches? What's the reality? What we'll talk today is in Protestant America within our context of PCUSA congregations, and how do we think about that? We will take some time to break out into little small groups because I think it's invaluable to talk with one another. One, to know we're not alone in our experiences of ministry and how they've changed over the last number of decades, but also as we think for tomorrow. So we'll do that a bit. Karen, would you open us in prayer and then we'll continue from there?
Absolutely. Let us pray. Good and gracious God, what an amazing thing it is to be able to come together as your church from all different places and through this unique way, this amazing technology. It's not the same as meeting face to face, God. We know that, but we know that regardless of how we do this, you're still in the midst of us. You're still in the middle of all of it. Give us wisdom, grant us the grace to be able to listen to each other and above all, to listen to your voice. May we be guided by you this day. In your name we pray. Amen.
And can you see my screen okay?
Yes.
Great. I am going to just expand this. See more of you, and I'm going to try to look ahead at the screen so it looks like I'm looking at you, but if I glance to the side, it's because I have a separate display that I can look at your faces. So let's go ahead and kick this off. the big question is, who are we? And does the Presbyterian Church USA look like the rest of American Protestantism? As we ask that question, I want to take a step back. I heard from a couple of you why you're here. Anyone else want to sort of popcorn style lift up why you were drawn to this meeting today?
I'm interested in finding ways to take the church out to the people, and I was kind of hoping I could get some ideas.
Very good. Thanks, Connie. Anyone else? David, maybe?
I'm serving a small church of about 120 members, so that's not as small as they come by any means. But I have a lot of involvement with churches smaller than ours who are in some degree of distress or likely distress based on age and numbers. So I want to be a good neighbor.
Very good. Anyone else? David Sperling, did you want to speak? You lit up.
The church that I'm a member of has been on tender hooks for at least 60 years and hasn't particularly gotten larger, hasn't really gotten all that much smaller. And some of us are hopeful that we will be able to enlarge our congregation. That process of enlargement has eluded us for 6 decades. So I'm interested in your wisdom.
Fair, fair. Well, and I think today will give us some context to really get the conversation going, to really hear where we are and the realities of the church across the country. And then if this is really a conversation you folks find useful, what we'll do is on the 11th of May, I will have some homework for you to do ahead of time. And we're going to talk about where our churches are from an assessment looking at the whole group of churches together. And then from there, our June meeting would really be able to look at a couple of case studies and what are other churches doing. You know, our churches continuing as they always have. What does that mean for the future? Will they still be vital and vibrant, or in choosing not to do anything, does that make major decisions for them where their church might close? Does your church have the capacity to reinvigorate itself, experience some resurrection for continued ministry? Or might resurrection be that you realize the time has come to close the church, but there's opportunity to continue spurring ministry for the sake of the gospel, even after a church might close? Or some churches do nothing, die, but the session doesn't get to claim what that legacy looks like. So we're going to talk about some different models even further ahead of what churches have done, how they have done it well, where churches have learned from. We have good cases and bad cases we like to share. But today we're going to really dig into what's our context now. So does the Presbyterian Church USA look like the rest of American Protestantism? That's the real question. We know that 85% of congregations have plateaued or are declining. This is American Protestantism in total. It was predicted that between 2000 and 2020, 55,000 congregations were going to close. Now, we don't have those final numbers in for 2020 yet. Someday I'll be able to update this for you, but that was the great prediction across the American Protestants in total. We're talking Episcopalians, Methodists, Lutherans. And often we wonder, who are we competing with? And what we hear more and more often, it's those mega churches that are cropping up. That's who mainline or old line Protestants are competing with, is those mega churches that are non-denominational. And typically they're defined with a weekly worship attendance of 2,000 or more people. Their average age is 40, very similar to the average age of an American, which is 38. They have more singles, and 45% as opposed to 10% of them are old line churches. 94% have previously attended another church, and 44% another congregation. 68% have attended their current congregation for 5 years or less. So we think about, who are we? We know that as the Peace USA, our current context, we have a noticeable decline in worship attendance. What was considered regular worship attendance 10 years ago with twice a month has now dropped to even once a month. The population loss or change in demographics in the church's local community has played a huge part. Community zoning issues that alter neighborhoods are significant, and there's an ever-increasing struggle in meeting the financial demands of the annual operating and missional budgets. We have a shortage of available new leadership, and we're going to continue to see that rise. At the Presbyterian Foundation, we house the Theological Education Fund, and Lee Hinson Hasty has done a lot of work around this. And what is stunning is that in the next 10 years, over 60% of our clergy will be retired. So that will be dramatic. And people haven't been going to seminary in the numbers in the last decade that they were the previous decade. We have an ever increasing struggle with meeting the financial demands of the annual and operating missional budgets. I guess I already said that one. An inability to meet objectives or a lack of ability to articulate a clear vision for ministry. This happens so often in our churches, and we have a lot of faithful people who love the church, but they just can't speak to what the ministry is about. What makes it transformational? What purpose does it have in the community? My colleague Paul Greer worked with a church in Philadelphia, and he was with them, working with them, trying to discern what to do with our project regeneration. And a week later, he was on a plane with a fellow from Philadelphia who just happened to be from that very same neighborhood. And Paul said, "Oh, I was just at a church there last week working with them." And the fellow said, "Oh, that church closed a long time ago." And Paul said, "No, I was there." And they said, no, that church hasn't been open for a long time. We walk our dog every Sunday and those front doors are locked up tight. That church hasn't been doing any ministry. And Paul quickly called the pastor within that week to say, "Hey, tell me what's going on, because I met one of your neighbors." And he said, the fellow doesn't think the church even exists anymore and that the front doors are locked. And he said, "Well, yeah, they are locked. You know, no one uses the front doors." That's a problem. Visitors aren't going to come in. Visitors don't know that. And Paul said, "Well, how many people are gathering with worship again? I thought this was your average worship attendance. Wouldn't you see the church alive and moving on Sunday morning?" "Well, everyone parks out behind the church. You wouldn't see that from the street." And so there's so much that we need to do to be able to articulate our mission and ministry well, that our neighbors and friends know what's going on, and they actually might want to be a part of it because they believe it is making a difference for the sake of the gospel. And so that plays into our church context often. And then the general aging of our church's membership. I had served a church in Warren, Pennsylvania, on the edge of the PA-New York border. And when I left there to take this call with the foundation 7.5 years ago, we had 350 members. Sounds like a really good sized church. But 25% of our membership was 85 to 101. In the last 7 years, their worship attendance has dropped from about 120 in worship. Now you think, golly, they still had a generous understanding of membership if they had 120 people in worship at 350 on the rolls, but a lot of our folks were older, many not able to get there in person, but it's dropped to half of that now. Many of the people that were in that 85 to 101 span, the actuarial tables were not their friends. Folks joined the church triumphant. Others moved to be closer to children. And so that church, just by the aging of its membership, is experiencing decline. So we think about, who are we? Membership has fallen 24% in the last 15 years in the Peace USA. And the number of our congregations has fallen by 7% in that same period. Now, some of my colleagues like to say, if you were McDonald's and your sales were down by 24%, do you think you would only close 7% of your franchises? Now, we're not in the for-profit business, right? But it does make us wonder, if we're shrinking so much and you have all of these overhead costs, the building, electricity, gas, everything else, what's going on here? We also know that 30% of our congregations have a membership of 50 or fewer people. And 13% of our congregations have a membership of 25 or fewer persons. And we have seen 90 congregational mergers nationally in the last 5 years. That's not very much. Now, the truth be told, there are a lot of churches who don't want to merge. They've talked about that, or maybe they've yoked. What we are finding these days is there are more churches who would prefer to ecclesiastically shack up, meaning they'll share a building, but they won't merge the congregation. They'll still have independent ministries. We might even see 3 or 4 churches come and use one building. And that can be tough sometimes, because really, the toughest question is, who gets the kitchen when and who gets the prime worship hour, right? But if you can figure those things out, many churches have found that ecclesiastically shacking up, where some churches are able to sell their buildings and then nest in with another church where they don't have the overall head of the building, but are able to pay rent to that church whose building they're using, it's mutually beneficial to 2, 3, 4, however many congregations involved. So it's really interesting what we're seeing these days. And I know in some of our presbyteries, even if you're not doing that sharing of buildings, we're seeing that more and more churches don't want to even yoke together, but they'll have this pastor for 50% time, and this church over here will have that same pastor for 50% time, creating a full-time call, but they don't want to be yoked, right? And so they still have to figure out the details. But it's interesting how our churches are trying to think through and do ministry without getting caught up on some of the issues that might have held them back from figuring out some basic efficiencies so that more of their revenue can go into mission and ministry, and not just going into the building that is a place for us to do ministry. As I talk about this, do some of these statistics sound like your churches? What do you think?
Ellie, my observation is if that we were McDonald's, if we were a business,
Mhm.
we would not have the congregations that we have. On strictly business model, churches would be closed left and right. But there's something about us that doesn't fit the business model.
Well, and I think the big question is there vitality to our ministry? You know, 100 years ago, a lot of our churches had missions out in smaller communities. And some of our small communities were the host church that sponsored a mission even further out, right? Because they believed there was a place that there is real need for that Reformed perspective and opportunity to engage in mission and ministry. So it might not have been a full-blown church, but there was certainly a presence. You know, looking at it as where is God calling us and where can we be of service and how can this be vital ministry is a key question. But some of our churches are dying on the vine, and they are too afraid to take steps to do anything differently. And sometimes that might be closing, but even if a church closes, it doesn't mean that community still doesn't need a great Reformed presence. Maybe it needs to be recreated and come out of the ashes, a real resurrection moment. And we also know, though, small churches are those who have been historically small often fare better because they don't have huge buildings. I grew up in a church that was 900 members in 1978. Now they have about 45 people in worship. Their building takes up half of a city block. They can't afford it. The only thing keeping them going is a few people did some planned giving 20 years ago. And so some bequests are coming in, but it's just kicking the can down the road, right? It's often those churches that once had much larger campuses that resizing can make such a difference. And those churches that have been historically small or historical small churches, they find the capacity to keep on going. And who was it that said their church 60 years ago was in question? Was that Neil?
No, it was me.
Oh, that was David. Yeah. We hear those stories plenty of times that, you know, Presbytery thought they were going to close this church 50, 60 years ago, and here you still are.
Well, the reason that this church has survived is that it is a small structure. And unlike a number of churches in the presbytery who are between a rock and a very, very hard place, we have been able to maintain the structure with a very small congregation. And over the past 10 or 12 years, we've put $60,000 into that structure. Now that is a major commitment.
It is. And, you know, if you're being faithful to stewarding that building, so you're not having delayed deferred maintenance costs you a lot more in the long run than if you're doing it as you go, or doing a capital campaign every 10 years or so to think about, you know, what do we need to be doing to prepare ourselves for the next 10 years of ministry? And that can make a huge difference, certainly. Tell me, within your presbyteries, hearing the typical Peace USA congregation, does that look like your presbytery, or how do your presbyteries look different? We have 4 presbyteries here today.
No, they don't. One of the things I was telling my folks during a Bible study was when I went to General Assembly, believe it or not, we have tons of young people and people of color, none of which we see in our local churches. So I think we look very different. And I think that's kind of very disturbing.
Well, in some cases, Ben, the churches are largely white, but so is the local population.
Well, I know in the Susquehanna Valley, you know, we have a lot of small churches. But the problem is with all of our churches in this area, they're old and they're constantly needing maintenance. You know, the concern seems to be about how do we maintain and preserve the building, which could add up cost-wise over the year, and it takes away from what are we doing mission-wise. You know, the preservation of the church itself seems to be of deep importance to the people. And we're an older community, you know. You look at the demographics, you look at, you know, many of the churches are in very poor communities. There's just no work for them. So new families aren't going to want to come into these areas. So there's a lot of challenges.
Anyone else want to speak to if your presbytery looks like the rest of the denomination?
Well, just thinking of Genesee Valley, when I first came here almost 35 years ago, we had, I think, 75 churches. And now we have, I think, 66, somewhere around there. So that is borne out by the story you told. The piece that you mentioned that I hadn't really considered before that I think is fairly frightening is the retirement of skilled pastors. Because at the precise moment that we need, you know, the best modern skills that we can find anywhere, the churches on the margins, the smaller, more rural churches, are going to have real difficulty recruiting that pastor who's going to have the skills to lead them into a future. I mean, that's on top of the problem that churches often think that the new pastor will solve everything. That's a problem in itself. But if you don't have a pastor at all, that's a problem too.
Absolutely, absolutely. And, you know, I think about the fact that I used to work at Pittsburgh Theological Seminary. My first call out of seminary from 2000 to 2010 was Associate Director of Admissions and Director of the Summer Youth Institute, which was a Lilly initiative for high school youth. It's still going on. If you have any high school juniors, I think because of COVID, it's on breaks this year, but next year, hopefully it'll be going again at both Westminster and Waynesburg colleges using Pittsburgh Seminary faculty. But the decade I served that program, we had, well, and the 3 years previous that I worked with two of those, we had 392 young people from 48 states and Puerto Rico come through our program. And it was just extraordinary. And when I left, 19% of those young people who had graduated from college went on to ministry. So we did see a climb, right? But then not long after I left in 2010, we began hearing, you know, churches can't afford full-time pastors. People will need to be tent makers. Don't really encourage folks to go into ministry. And as Jim's lifting up, it's more critical than ever that we encourage folks whom we see have gifts for ministry to consider it. And what's interesting is with small churches, you know, there are churches who might not be able to call and install a pastor. And so they're not going to draw folks who really want those full benefits from Board of Pensions in the pastor participation plan, who can also dig into programs with debt assistance. But know that beyond Board of Pensions, our Office for Financial Aid for Service out of the General Assembly's offices offers to those in temporary supply and part-time work, debt forgiveness for college and seminary. And that might help get folks into those smaller churches too. Though you're not going to necessarily pay as much if it's a part-time position, et cetera, that knowing that there are resources there from the denomination that might be able to lessen the impact of educational debt really might help get people in to serve you as well. So Karen, did you know about that program?
I did.
Oh, good. I talked with a executive recently who didn't know about it. So I'm glad you know about it.
Yeah. There's some issues around that to some extent, and we can talk about that at some other point.
Okay.
I think, there's complications with all these things, but yeah.
Yeah.
So
there's some different tools out there too.
So just sort of rewinding a bit to the conversation about, do our congregations look like our communities? And just for folks that don't know, Research Services offers a free demographic tool. It doesn't have a lot of bells and whistles, but if you go to Research Services at the PCUSA website, and you look at demographic study, it's right there on the right-hand side. You can pull up your church and all sorts of information about the community around you. And what's fun with that is that oftentimes there's a surprise there, and it's kind of neat to say, oh, I had no idea that we had that many kids in our area, or we didn't have that many kids in our area, or there are people who don't look like us in our area. So I would encourage you exploring that as well.
And then piggybacking off of that is when your community of faith normally meets, whether it's in person or virtually, have a couple people on that Sunday go tooling around the community to see where are people when we're usually in our worship space. What are they doing? Really pay attention to the ways your neighbors are engaging. It'll give you perhaps a greater sense of who they are and what they're drawn to at that time too. So that's a really helpful tool. So if we think of the Presbyterian member, who are we talking about? What we know is the average Presbyterian is a 63-year-old female and typically married. Republican and college educated typically. But we know many of our churches are purple. So doesn't mean they're necessarily Republican, but the study that Paul Greer did shows this. Upper middle class, making $90,000 or more in income. They're self-described moderate to conservative theology. They attend at least 2 to 3 times per month. They give $2,000 or more per year to their congregation. 42% of average Presbyterians were raised Presbyterian. That means 58% were not. 69% of average Presbyterians make a pledge. 51% have been ordained a deacon or elder. The average tenure in their congregation is 17 years, and 51% of average Presbyterians don't work. Why? Because they are retired. Now we look at that number and we think our average member is a 63-year-old. The average American is a 38-year-old. What does that tell us? Our average member is the parent of an average American. Now, when you look at this, tell me, does this resonate with you? Does this sound like a Presbyterian, or are you like me and think, I think our congregations are a lot more purple than what's said here is Republican? Anything else that might jump out at you?
My congregations are in Delaware County, so they're in the poorest county in the state. And so when I see the upper middle class 90,000, that doesn't apply. That doesn't work.
Does not resonate. I hear you.
One thing that concerns me is that in the Rochester area anyway, a lot of that retired generation are earning good pensions from the Kodak jobs they had for their whole lives. What happens when that generation is gone and we don't have that steady income stream? it's going to be more challenging. Now, not every community has a Kodak, but it's been a major factor in the Rochester area.
Absolutely. And then, you know, more and more younger people are finding they're on contract work, right?
Right.
There's less certainty in their livelihood, and it creates, just makes them much more transient in nature, which can affect their tenure in the congregation. You know, it's interesting if we look at the typical PCUSA member compared to the typical megachurch member, their average tenure is 5 years. 5 years. So we have something going with that 17 years, right? And for many of those churches, that might be a place where people may rotate through the doors of that mega church and come and fall in love with our small congregations and the ministries we're about.
Yeah.
But kind of some key factors, other points here that interest you.
I have to say, my daughter is the youngest member of our congregation, and she's 52. We don't have any children, any young people, any young adults anymore. And the one young family we have kids that are into sports on weekends, and the father works every day God sends. And I think what we need is not new people, but a new direction. We need, I was really caught by your phrase that we're unable to articulate our outreach. Where are we going? What are we doing? Why are we here? If we're not here to serve God, then we might as well stay home. But how do we do that in a small community?
Yeah, churches have a default outreach program which consists of the following. We expect that more people just like ourselves will eventually wander into our church and take our places and do the things that we consider valuable. And that model has not worked, for 50 years? But we still persist in believing that it's so. And I think our veteran members are always discouraged when we gain new members and they move on after 5 years. For them, it's a lifetime of loyalty that we should expect from people who become members of the church, not just another stop on life's journey for a few years at a time.
Well, part of the problem is that it is a mobile generation that we have raised, that they don't stay in one house for 50 years or 70 years. They job, I won't say job hop because I don't mean it that way, but they move from job to job and town to town. They can't be expected to stay in one church for their whole life.
I think the early demographics that were in competition with mega churches, I think that's overstated. We're in competition with our culture. We have so many competing aspects of people believing that in order to keep the family together, they have to do independent things together, which are not spiritual in nature. They need to travel, they need to shop. It's their needs, not what they want. I mean, what they actually have as part of their history. They have divorced themselves from their past because they are now the American independents. And I think it's our culture, the landscape of the culture that we're reacting to, and not worry about other churches. If 80% of the people went to a church on Sunday, I don't care which church it would be, they would be getting some spiritual nurturing. But to say that we're in competition, I think that's overstating it. It's really, what do we do in the community to have them grow in their spirituality? And of course they profess that, well, I am spiritual, I do yoga or I do other meditation techniques, but that's not the community of faith. And that's where, as Christians, we're called to share in a community, not to just be independent worshipers.
One of the differences that I noted as you were going through these things, I have, I think, one of the most liberal congregations in the entire presbytery. So politically, for a small country church, I think we are an anomaly. The thing that also resonates is, yes, our church is dominated and run by women. If it wasn't for those women, those older women, I wouldn't be there and the church wouldn't be there. As we talk about things like membership, first of all, I have banned discussions of membership for the most part, because I think it's a numerical focus that gets us distracted. So what we've been talking about is the idea that, I think the church's real issue is that nobody understands why we matter, right? Or what we have to offer them. My church, they've done zero outreach, right, prior to my arrival. And I'm the first pastor they've had in like 10 years. So, why should anyone come here? I mean, I think that's a question that we haven't fully answered. That's because we are coming out of the hangover of the golden age, where if you built it, they came. And that's dead. That's over. Part of the problem, as we idolize young people, right, we turn them into the golden calves of our survival. And we think that they're all a bunch of heathens. The reality is, I've done studies of millennials for other nonprofit work. They actually have very deep convictions, and they tend to be loyal to those institutions that speak to their convictions. We've not done that in any really serious way. And I think that's another disconnect from the denomination, right? The denomination, I think, has been doing some better work in the area of speaking to the convictions of people who are attracted to our particular theology.
You're right. And Ben, as you name that, millennials, we know they're going to connect with an organization because they believe in what they're doing.
Yeah.
And they can be hands-on and active in that mission. And then after that, they will also support it financially. But first, they want to be engaged with their time because they really believe in it. And that's where you have that gap, that if we can't articulate what we're about, are we here just because this is our family and that's where we've always come? Or do we understand ourselves to be the body of Christ, and we see we can express what it means to be the body of Christ, engaging the world, not just internally, but reaching out with the good news and mission and ministry too. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Which brings me to the next question. Is this your typical member? Why or why not? Go back. That's the member. Is that your typical member? Yes or no? So we heard from Ben that it's a more liberal congregation, so they're not going to say, yes, moderate to conservative theology. But that's where his church is. How about other churches?
Well, strangely enough, within the Cayuga-Syracuse Presbytery, compared to the national church, we are a liberal presbytery.
Yes.
And have been for years. The one thing, to go back to a point that was made earlier, congregations need to be able to ask, why would somebody walk through the front door to spend Sunday morning with us? We are a community. The congregation is a community. Are we accepting and encouraging to people to come? Congregations are not homogeneous, but they do hang together as a community, and certainly New Hope is no exception. We have Genghis Khan and the Roaring Liberal all in the same sanctuary for an hour every week. And we get along and we cherish one another. but we haven't been really good at deciding how to interact with the community writ large to get new blood coming into our community.
Thank you, David. How about any of the three Lauries, or Karen, or Nancy, or Joanna, or Louise? I don't think we've heard from you folks.
Well, it sounds like the church up in Lawrence, where I am, how do we connect with the people who are not in church? And we do have quite a mixed type of people in whether they're Republicans or liberal or conservative. And I think that we try to honor and accept each person as they are. But how to bring that out into the community is difficult, very, very difficult. And I would say that we may have young families, but the majority of us are approaching 70 or in their 70s like me.
Right. So that's when we say average age. It's not median age, it's average age.
Yeah, yeah.
Which makes it interesting too, huh?
Yes.
How about the Lauries? Lori Anson or Shipman?
Yes. We are definitely on the older end of that average. I'm one of the youngest and I'm in my 50s. We had started to develop a youth program, and now we have absolutely no youth, especially with COVID. That's eliminated anyone coming that has a child for the most part. We're a small community, but there are definitely kids right around our church. And like was said before, sports are huge on a Sunday. I'm very disappointed in that. When I was growing up, there was an understanding in our community that Wednesday nights would be open for church activities and Sunday would be left alone. And that's definitely not the norm anymore. You know, I don't know. And yes, we're mostly non-Presbyterians that have come to the Presbyterian Church. I think that kind of covers the main background, but it's very disappointing trying to get to younger families. If they aren't involved in sports, they're so exhausted from the rest of their week, or at least that's an excuse I hear. You know, I don't know if it's a change of time or.
No, COVID time, it's real, believe me.
Yeah.
COVID time particularly, it's very real.
Absolutely, and very understandable. I mean, I think what really took us down with young families was the recession. That's when we had just started to build them up, and then we had families that had gone through divorces, and so they were, you know, going between parents. One family had a parent that was working out of state, so weekends were when they were able to get together. And then from there, most any other family that has tried to come, sports take over their lives on Sundays, and we never see them.
Which then begs the question, how do we live into our baptismal promises and help think about ways to provide tools to the family for Christian education that might not happen in our traditional methods, certainly not in our models of the 1950s of Sunday school and VBS, right?
Or why does worship have to be Sunday morning at 10 o'clock?
Absolutely.
That's another point. But what other time is available? that's the other thing. Because there are so many other things that take over young families.
I think larger churches have the capacity to gather people in multiple ways on different days and times and different platforms that are very difficult for a small church to maintain. we've been doing hybrid worship for the last year with people in the sanctuary and people at home on Zoom. And we just had a very interesting meeting last night where the decision is being made that we're going to wean ourselves from Zoom and maybe replace some of that with podcasts. But it just strikes me that while that may be a reasonable decision right now, I think it's short-sighted in the long term, that we had actually developed a technology that did work to include people from out of state and people who are too elderly or ill to come to the sanctuary. So I feel like we're backtracking on that a little bit. But I think a larger church just has different capacities that smaller churches don't have. And that's critical.
Yeah, Jim, I think that's a real issue, but I'm also wondering if it might be possible for smaller congregations to band together, to still do their own thing on a Sunday morning, but to offer, communal Bible studies or, prayer groups or whatever that would perhaps take place using Zoom as a way of meeting the needs of those people who can't be there on a typical Sunday morning.
Yeah, our presbytery is divided into 6 neighborhoods. And the neighborhood in Ontario County in Orleans County and Western Monroe County does have a weekly Zoom service that has no in-person component. It's available for people to tune into. So yeah, so smaller churches could band together.
Love that. Thank you for sharing that.
And then it's about sharing it, letting people know it's out there. Here's another resource. If you can't join us for our Sundays worship, connect with us here, and here are other avenues to connect in. Definitely. So what have you noticed over the last year? How are things different for ministry?
Just to add on the last idea, many communities, since they're now to the level of where they've been inoculated with the vaccine, the idea of cell churches in a community, I think that could be reinforced. Large churches, these mega churches, have somehow designated different cells, but there's no reason why you could eliminate having to be a specific church member, but just anybody in the community. You've got a lot of these suburban neighborhoods where out of 20 or 30 churches, homes, you probably could get 4 or 5 families to come together on a Wednesday or Thursday or Tuesday evening for an hour of worship without having to worry about refreshments. Just come together and share, and then you don't have to worry about Sunday morning, how many are going to show up for Sunday school class or for Bible study, and after church Bible study or review of the sermon. That might be another idea that smaller congregations could do if they join with other churches and just have those little community cells.
Thanks, Doug.
One thing that we did last year, we had hybrid services in April, May, and June. In the end of June, we ended up going to an outdoor service. And we sat on the front lawn of the church where everybody going by could see us. And we were still socially distanced, and families sat together and everybody wore their mask. But we had our worship service right out on the lawn, and we Zoomed it. So those who couldn't come or didn't feel comfortable coming could still worship with us. And as the fall went on, we just went straight to Zoom, and our choir kind of dwindled down to one person doing the introit, one person doing a solo for special music, and the pastor would sing the hymns, and everybody kept muted and sang along at home if they wanted to. And now we're getting back to the point where all of our leadership team has been inoculated, and we're getting ready to get back together to do choir and hybrid services again.
And I think key to keep in mind too, as we have more folks vaccinated, as I heard a lot of churches, or a number of you folks mention, you don't have the kids, or the kids aren't active as they once were. And my dad's professor, the Reverend Dr. Bill Orr, he was a mentor to Mr. Fred Rogers. My dad is just an ordinary disciple of Orr. Fred was like, he was Orr's major disciple. But he always said the church is a generation from death. So how do we think about what it means to engage younger generations who aren't at our doorsteps? They're not there, to share the gospel, give them a theological language, invite them into our communities, and help them to understand who they are as beloved children of God. Key questions when, the vaccines still have not been approved for children under the age of 16. And we think about what does it mean to be the church as we do come back to in-person. Some of our churches sure have been back in person 4 months, but others, as still as they're coming, what does it mean for those younger people in our population as we seek to reach them? Now it is 1:06, so I've already stolen 6 extra minutes of your time. I do have a couple other slides, but I want to honor your time. So I can always look at these last 3 slides in our next time together. Are you interested in having another conversation together?
Yes.
Yes, you are.
You are. Oh, that's good. How about others of you? I heard just a couple yeses.
I actually will be
Definitely,
gone.
yeah.
I will actually be gone that week, but I would be interested in following up the following month.
Okay, and we will record that too, so we can share it with you, Connie, and you'll be able to see the results. I am going to give you some homework, if I may, and I'm going to send a link to you, but I am going to ask you to go to a website, assessment.presbyterianfoundation.org. And Karen, you do have everyone's email address, right? So I'm going to send this to Karen and ask her to send it out to you, and ask her to share your email addresses with me. And you can fill it out today. It takes no more than 5 minutes, 10 minutes max, this questionnaire. Answer it to your best of your ability. If you don't know the answers, or you'd like another person from your church, you could have 2 or 3 people fill it out. What's interesting is it's going to take General Assembly statistics. Now, they're older statistics because GA has changed what we ask in statistics, and it's less questions. So we're basing the assessment back off of 2017, which sounds really outdated in 2021. But remember, 2020 data just went in, and we won't have that till July. So it sounds like it is 4 years old, but really it's only 3-year-old data. And
remember how old we are.
And when we look at it, when we come back to talk about it, we're going to look at the data that comes out of these assessments. And I'm going to say, does your church look like it did 3 years ago? Or have there been drastic changes? How would it have changed the results if we did have all of the current data on this? But what's neat about this, when you fill it out, you're going to go to assessment.presbyterianfoundation.org. You're going to answer about 8 or 9 questions. And it's going to, when you complete it, it will immediately send you an email with that report. And it takes your responses plus the GA statistics to generate the report. And so if you do have 2 or 3 people from your church fill it out, that report may look a little different based on who filled it out and their perception of the church. So that could be interesting to look at too. So if you want just one of you fill it out from each of your churches, or have 2 or 3 people fill it out, but fill that out for me. I will send you a reminder 2 weeks before we meet again. And then I'll send you a reminder 1 week before we meet. And I'll need those results. When I send that reminder, I'll give you 2 more days so that I have at least 5 days to put all those results together. I'll have some nice graphs, and we're not going to be picking out church by church, but we'll put all the information from each church up there so we can see, is this a common reality? It's going to look at participation. It's going to look at, this is a financial health assessment. So it's going to look at participation, debts and deficits, bequests, leadership, 9 different areas of church financial health. And what I love about it is it will give us a traffic light of green, you're doing well in this area. Yellow, it's an area to work on. Red, this is a really critical need. And it will help us think about what further conversations might we want to have together, and how can I be of resource to you as your church considers this, and as you're thinking about what does tomorrow look like? What does 5 years in ministry look like? I think it can be a useful tool, even though it's a bit outdated. Is that fair?